The scream tore through the new apartment before the boxes were open, and the narrator felt the walls recoil as Jake said, "That came from the hall." He held the floor plan like a shield, and traced clean lines that ended at a blank wall. The building hummed like a throat clearing, and a cold seam appeared where paint met shadow. Jake said, "There is no door here," yet a brass knob caught the weak dusk and turned memory bright. The air thinned, smelling of rain and old keys, and the corridor seemed longer than it had minutes ago. A whisper rose from the seam, too close to be distant, too distant to be inside his head. Jake said, "If someone is hurt, I have to check," though his hand shook like a paper leaf. The narrator marked how the silence pressed back, heavy, patient, unblinking. Somewhere a neighbor laughed, and the sound arrived late, like mail sent from another year. Jake said, "Just a peek," and the knob cooled his palm, then warmed like skin. The seam widened, a slice of deeper dark, and the plan in his other hand did not change. The door held a slice of dark like a throat that would not speak, and the narrator counted the beats as Jake said, "Hello, are you okay in there?" No voice answered, yet a draft tasted like basement and wet coins. He slid the chain on the front door out of habit, as if a hallway could escape into the street. Jake said, "I am calling someone," but he did not move toward his phone. The hush had a weight, and it pressed the drywall into a slight inward bow. Somewhere a pipe knocked in the old bones of the building. Jake said, "Just show me you are fine," and the seam sighed as if tired. He pressed his ear to the gap and heard nothing real, only a memory closing a latch. The floor plan sagged in his hand like a lie. Jake said, "The super will have a key," and the knob cooled, kinder now. He stepped back, measuring breath, and the slice of dark did not blink. Ethan arrived with a toolbox and a smirk that tried to be brave, and the narrator marked how relief looked borrowed on Jake. Ethan said, "Hidden closet. Old buildings do that," and he tapped the wall like it owed rent. The knob would not meet his eyes, yet his hand found it and paused. Jake said, "It was not here yesterday," and the paper with lines and numbers waited to be believed. The corridor smelled clean, then sour, then gone. Ethan said, "Drafts settling, you need sleep," while his laugh landed short. A long blink passed between them as if someone else counted. Jake said, "Open it," and the air thinned again. Ethan said, "Fine, but if ghosts charge rent, I am out," and he lifted the knob with a shrug that shook. The seam sharpened like a blade laid flat. The door opened wider than the wall should allow, and the narrator saw a room that did not fit the building. Cold air rolled out like breath from a cellar mouth. Ethan said, "It is just deep storage," yet his voice skipped a stare. Jake said, "That geometry is wrong," and he pinched the bridge of his nose. The floor inside sloped away in a slow swell, like a tide paused mid-turn. A string pull hung without a bulb, and shadows clung as if stitched. Ethan said, "Light is dead," and clicked his phone flashlight, then lowered it at once. Jake said, "Do you see the far corner move?" And the silence did not deny it. The plan crumpled in his hand like paper trying to remember water. Ethan said, "We close it and call the super," but the knob did not face them anymore. From the deeper dark came a whisper that wore the shape of a child's breath, and the narrator counted how Ethan's mouth closed on a joke. Jake said, "Who is there?" and the cold pressed his teeth. A small knock tapped twice far and near, like nails on glass. Ethan said, "Pipes," though the word had no bones. The room smelled of rain on stone that had never seen the sky. Jake said, "If you need help, say so," and the door inched wider by itself. Air tugged at his hoodie string, as if choosing him from a line. Ethan said, "We back out now," but his feet did not obey. A pale shape ghosted at the far slope, too slight to be a trick. Jake said, "I am here," and the shape turned, as if it had always known his name. Morning arrived thin and gray, and the narrator noted how sleep had not touched Jake. He lined boxes into tidy ranks, a ritual against the door. Jake said, "If I keep busy, the mind keeps quiet," and the kettle sighed. The floor plan lay flat, daring him to believe paper over sight. Ethan texted jokes that missed by inches, and the screen felt heavier than steel. Jake said it was real to the empty room, and the room did not argue. In the bathroom mirror, he found a face that belonged to last night. The knob stayed out of sight, yet presence pooled like cold under a draft. Jake said, "Work starts Monday," as if schedules could chaperone terror. He taped the plan to the wall, a scar over a wound he refused to name. Ethan arrived with coffee, and the stubborn confidence of a problem solver, and the narrator watched bravado buttoned like a coat. Ethan said, "We log it, measure it, prove it, and set tools down." Jake said, "Prove it to who?" and the hallway withheld its breath. Tape stretched across plaster, and numbers behaved until they did not. Ethan said, "Margins, swelling, old framing," while his eyes kept drifting. The blank wall measured one thing at noon, another at noon +1. Jake said, "You feel it tilt," and both men leaned without moving. A low knock came from nowhere and everywhere, then stopped. Ethan said, "Old pipes," with a voice that needed permission to hold. Jake wrote the figures anyway, because proof was a way to stand. At noon the super finally called back with a name that carried dust, and the narrator felt the building lean closer to listen. Mara said, "I keep records," through a voice lined with filing cabinets. Jake said, "There is a room that should not be," and silence tested the words. Ethan said, "We just need keys," pretending locks could matter. Papers rustled like leaves that never saw sun. Mara said, "Unit once reported a void that moved, then asked for an address he had already given." Jake said, "Can you come now?" and time stalled until she agreed. The hall brightened without gaining light, and their reflections stood thinner. Ethan said, "We get answers," while his hands sought a pocket without finding rest. Mara walked the corridor with a librarian's patience, and the narrator tracked how quiet gave her room to think. Mara said, "Buildings remember what we forget," and brushed the wall. Ethan said, "Walls do not move," though he did not stake his life on it. Jake said, "It opened here," and the paint looked newly old under her light. She unfolded a brittle plan that did not match his plan, then frowned. Mara said, "Same unit, different decade," and a void marked in red. The air cooled, as if a basement rose to meet the hall. Jake said, "There was a girl," and the words felt borrowed from a colder throat. Mara said, "Name might be Lily," and paper sighed like it recognized grief. They sat on the floor with maps spread like open wounds, and the narrator counted the ways paper can refuse agreement. Mara said, "This void appears after incidents, then vanishes, and circle dates." Ethan said, "Stories stack when maintenance is bad," but the line shook. Jake said, "Lily was real," and the name hung where air thinned. Photocopies showed a missing teen, whose photo blurred under weak toner. Mara said, "Tenants heard tapping and breath without lungs," and shut the folio. The kettle clicked far away, though no one had set it on. Jake said, "If it wants me, why me?" and the room waited for a price. Ethan said, "We bored it shut," yet no lumber could fit the shape of that dark. Night fell heavy, and the narrator marked how silence grew thick as cloth. Jake said, "The room breathes when the lights go out, while shadows stretched long." Ethan said, "It is tricks of the dark," though his hand shook. Mara set her lantern down and said, "Old voids echo fear until it shapes itself." A soft tap from the seam made all three flinch at once. Jake said, "If Lily is trapped, we cannot ignore her," and the wall shivered. Ethan laughed thin, saying, "You want ghosts to have names," yet his eyes betrayed him. Mara said, "Rooms are patient predators." The knob glowed faint with chill. The door inched wider, though none touched it, and the narrator traced their held breath. Jake said, "She wants us inside," and fear made the words fragile. Ethan said, "We bored it tonight," but the wood in his toolbox stayed still. Mara said, "You cannot wall silence," and her lantern flame bent inward as if pulled. A faint figure moved beyond the slope, soft and distant. Jake said, "That is her," and his eyes burned. Ethan said, Reflection trick, I will prove it. Yet his steps slowed. The draft grew colder, carrying the scent of soil and candle smoke. Mara said, "Rooms demand acknowledgement." Inside, the narrator noted, the air folded over itself like water disturbed. Jake stepped first, saying, "We need to know," and his shoes echoed wrong. Ethan muttered, "This is insane," while his beam skittered on angled walls. Mara said, "The shape shifts when observed," and her notes trembled. The floor sloped down, then flattened as if the room shifted its mind. Jake said, "It is not built to be walked," his chest heaving. A low hum rose, metallic and steady. Ethan said, "It is alive," then bit his tongue. Mara whispered, "Not alive, but aware." Their reflections bent across surfaces that should have been solid. A child's whisper coiled around them, and the narrator said it bent like music underwater. Jake said, "Lily, it is me," though he did not know her. A pale silhouette flickered near the far angle. Ethan said, "Not real, not real," as his breath came sharp. Mara said, "Some victims echo until they are answered," and her voice thinned. The floor rippled once like a living surface, and their shadows dragged behind. Jake said, "We cannot leave her," and his fingers trembled. Ethan muttered, "Leave her means we leave ourselves," and stepped back. The air turned colder, and the knob vanished behind them. The hum swelled into a low pulse, and the narrator measured how the walls moved with it. Jake said, "She is asking for release," and his voice broke. Ethan said, "Release means we join her," shaking his head. Mara whispered, "The void feeds on choice," and her folio pages fluttered without wind. The figure of Lily raised her hand, palm out, eyes hollow. Jake said, "I know your name," and she froze in recognition. Ethan stumbled back, muttering curses. The floor stretched longer, and the door shrank further away. Mara said, "Every step binds you tighter," yet Jake did not stop. The room inhaled. The narrator felt the walls pulse like veins, each beat shaking dust into the air. Jake said, "The room is closing around us," his eyes fixed on Lily's wavering shape. Ethan said, "We need to run," but his feet stuck like roots. Mara whispered, "The void binds with memory," and she held the brittle plan tighter. The knob was now a faint shimmer far away, unreachable. Jake said, "We cannot leave her," and his voice broke across the dark. Ethan growled, "She is not real, just a trick," though his knuckles whitened. The floor rippled beneath them as if water frozen mid-wave. The hum grew louder until thought staggered. The narrator marked how the air thinned, forcing shallow gasps. Mara said, "She binds to grief, that is her anchor." Jake said, "She knows my name," though no one had told her. Lily's whisper drifted closer, fragile yet sharp. Ethan said, "Names are bait," and sweat slid down his temple. Jake said, "She is alone. We cannot abandon her," his fists tight. Mara pressed, "Do not step further. The floor is not what it seems." Shadows curled around their ankles like water. The knob flashed once in the distance, then vanished again. Jake said, "She is reaching for me," and stepped toward the ripple. The narrator heard Ethan snap, "I will end this," and he raised his hammer. Jake shouted, "No," but the echo fractured like glass. Mara said, "You strike, and it will consume faster." Ethan growled, "Better broken than living in its mouth." He swung at the shifting wall, and the sound echoed deep, wrong, endless. The hum shifted into a roar, and the floor buckled. Jake staggered, shouting, "You made it angry." Lily's shape flickered like a candle in wind. Mara screamed, "Do not let go of each other," but the space stretched, pulling them apart like taffy. The narrator counted their breaths, ragged and uneven. Jake grabbed Ethan's arm, yelling, "Stop, you will kill her." Ethan shouted, "She is already dead." The room stretched so far the lantern light barely touched them. Mara said, "She is not asking for death, she is asking to be remembered." Lily's eyes glowed faintly, sorrowful, focused on Jake. Jake said, I see you, and his chest heaved. Ethan said, do not answer her, trembling. The walls folded in closer, as if inhaling. Mara whispered, recognition weakens the void, but it will lash out. The hum surged into a scream. The narrator felt the floor tilt into a descent. Jake stumbled, saying, she wants me to follow. Ethan shouted, that is suicide, grabbing his sleeve. Mara said, choice defines survival, her voice brittle. Lily lifted her hand higher, and Jake felt a tug at his chest. He said, she is trapped, like I have been, his voice breaking. Ethan barked, you are not her, but his grip faltered. Mara said, if you reach her you risk being claimed, her lantern flickering. The room groaned like a beast stirring, and shadows wrapped around their legs. Jake whispered, I cannot let her vanish again. The narrator felt the shift as the room stilled, silence thick as stone. Jake said, she knows me, his voice hollow but certain. Mara whispered, the void binds bloodlines, not strangers. Ethan barked, you are losing it, yet his face drained pale. Jake clutched the floor plan, noticing a name scrawled faint in red ink, Mercer, blurred but legible. His hands trembled. Jake said, she is family, and the air turned colder. Lily's form solidified, her eyes locked on him. Mara said, the void feeds on unfinished grief, and she shut the folio with a snap. Ethan muttered, this is a curse, his voice breaking into echoes. The knob behind them was gone. The narrator traced Jake's breath as he whispered, she is my blood, my family's secret. Ethan shook his head, saying, your family never told you because it is poison. Mara said, the void takes root in lineage, it grows from what is hidden. Lily raised her hand again, her expression torn between plea and pain. Jake said, she died here, and the words dragged weight across the air. Ethan said, stop giving it power. His fists clenched. Mara whispered, recognition heals, but it also opens the door wider. Shadows climbed the walls like rising water. Jake said, then I will not turn away. The hum returned as a low dirge, and the narrator felt the void tighten. Jake said, she was erased, not forgotten, his voice heavy with grief. Ethan said, erased for a reason, but doubt cracked his tone. Mara whispered, the void thrives on silence, break it, and she loosens. Lily mouthed words they could not hear, her lips forming Jake's name. Jake said, I see you, Lily, and the air quivered. Ethan shouted, do not speak to it, but his fear betrayed belief. Mara said, truth is your weapon, but it cuts both ways. Shadows stretched toward Jake as if embracing him. The narrator said, the void began to show its true face, corners folding into jagged teeth. Jake said, she was abandoned here, and his hands trembled with rage. Ethan growled, stop making her real, his voice breaking. Mara whispered, she is real enough, denial does not erase her. The room shook as if answering, dust raining from seams. Lily stepped closer, her figure stronger, pale dress flowing like water. Jake said, you deserved better, and his tears streaked in the cold. Ethan said, you are feeding it, his hammer useless at his side. Mara said, release is near, but beware the cost. The narrator heard the void scream, a sound like broken glass pulled through bone. Jake shouted, I will carry your name, as if sealing a pact. Lily's eyes softened, her form stabilizing. Ethan yelled, you will not survive this, clawing at his sleeve. Mara said, if he names her, he claims the curse, her voice sharp. Jake said, she will not vanish into silence, his chest heaving. The floor split in jagged seams, pulling the lantern light down. Lily reached with trembling fingers, closer than before. Jake stepped forward, whispering, you are not alone. The void roared in defiance. The narrator felt the void draw taut like a held breath, and the floor pitched toward a black heart. Jake said, take me instead, and the room answered with a grinding hush. Lily wavered as if stitched from frost, and her eyes begged without sound. Ethan said, "You do not trade with a pit," while his grip tore at Jake's sleeve. Mara said, "Bargains here bind in blood," and she spread the brittle plans like wards. The walls folded, revealing stairs that spiraled nowhere, and dust fell like gray snow. Jake said, "She is family," and the word opened a corridor lined with mirrors. Ethan said, "Family does not ask for drowning," yet the mirrors showed him sinking. Mara said, "Name her fully, then name yourself," and her lantern shook. Jake said, "Lily Hart Mercer," and the air rang like thin glass. The corridor shortened, and the mirrors cracked into rivers of light. Lily mouthed, "Thank you," and the void curled closer to listen. The narrator counted 3 heartbeats as the room tasted the new name, and a seam split across the ceiling. Jake said, "I claim her," and the crack bled cold air. Ethan said, "Claim your way out," but his voice failed on the last word. Mara said, "Finish the rite before it learns you," and she traced a red circle on wood. The floor twitched like skin under ice, and the circle trembled. Jake said, "Lily Hart Mercer, you are seen," and the lantern throbbed. Lily whispered without breath, and white frost crawled up the walls. Ethan said, "This place eats vows," and he lifted the hammer then lowered it. Mara said, "Truth binds, not force," and she pressed the folio to the circle's edge. The ceiling seam widened into a lidless eye, and the room leaned down to swallow. Jake said, "I remember you," and the eye shuddered closed. The narrator felt time kink as the room unrolled a memory like old film, and a child's sob echoed from behind the mirrors. Jake said, "Show me," and the glass rewound to a locked door and a storm. Ethan said, "Do not look," yet he leaned in despite himself. Mara said, "Witness without drowning," and her fingers drummed a steady count. The vision revealed Lily alone, small hands red from knocking, and the night did not answer. Jake said, "I am here now," and the film bucked, spitting sparks. Ethan said, "This is cruelty wearing a face," and shame moved across his eyes. Mara said, "Speak the unfinished line," and she nodded at Jake. He said, "I open for you," and the latch in the vision clicked. The room screamed, but the mirrors softened into rain. The narrator said the void recoiled as if burned, and the stairs folded back into flatness. Jake said, "Come with me," and Lily stepped, leaving a print of frost that hissed away. Ethan said, "If she crosses, what crosses with her?" and he scanned the ceiling seam. Mara said, "Seal with witness and breath," and she held the lantern high. The floor heaved once, and a black rope of shadow lashed at Jake's ankles. He said, "Not today," and he kicked free with a ragged boot. Lily reached the circle, and the red line brightened. Ethan said, "I have you," grabbing her wrist that felt like cold smoke. Mara said, "Speak together now," and her voice cut through the groan. Jake said, "We remember Lily Hart Mercer," and the room cracked like ice in spring. The narrator marked the final pull as the room tried to swallow all sound, and the lantern guttered to a nail of flame. Jake said, "Take me if you must," and the floor split in a hungry grin. Ethan said, "No trades, no more," and he stepped beside him. Mara said, "Shared witness breaks the hold," and she set the folio at their feet. The black grin snapped shut, as if starved, and the circle pulsed once. Lily said, "Let me go," and the words arrived with the weight of years. Jake said, "You are free," and his voice steadied. Ethan breathed, "We keep her name," and his shoulders fell. Mara said, "Close," and she blew across the line like wind over embers. The room sighed, long and low, and the door returned, as simple wood. Dawn pressed thin against the windows, and the narrator marked how quiet finally chose a side. Jake said, "It is only wood now," and the door looked harmless in the gray. Ethan said, "Harmless does not mean gone," though his voice no longer shook. Mara said, "Names hold fast after night," and she gathered the plans with slow care. The apartment smelled of dust and kettle steam, ordinary as a weekday. Jake said, If she is